Are you ready?
Yep, just trying to share my screen here.
Okay.
Can you see my screen? I can't.
It's a beautiful slide.
Is it a beautiful slide? So I should just trust that it can be seen then.
Well, the bubbles, it says benefits of open sourcing artificial general intelligence. Mark
Uh,
Walker, Government Blockchain Association.
and an email. Awesome. So this is one of our first presentations on the advantages and disadvantages of open sourcing artificial general intelligence and to the same extent, collective intelligence. The title was actually one that David gave me, so you all can certainly guess which side he's on. So I have a fairly quick agenda, cover the old definition of open source, talk about AGI safety and control, and then talk about crowdsourcing itself. Open source has a very standard definition. I'm sure that everyone has seen it before. There are related things in terms of open source intelligence in the intelligence community and open knowledge. But really, most of what we're talking is crowdsourcing wisdom. We're talking about open sourcing software to some extent, but this is actually much bigger than that. So for all you people who are afraid of the future, it's worthwhile looking at this and deciding what you're actually afraid of. The order in which I'm afraid of things can start at the top and then go counterclockwise. The image in the top middle is from Slaughterbots. Unfortunately, this is current technology and it's just waiting for some government contractor to get the idea that this is a bright idea. Everyone recognizes HAL 9000. This is sort of the epitome of artificial intelligence programmed with improper goals. Dave really did have to shut him down. The Singularity Institute, the original one, not the university, is scary to me personally as an AGI researcher because a number of AGI researchers have actually received death threats from them. They are tremendously afraid of progress on this front. They're sure that it will lead to the annihilation of humanity. And they are very, very loud voices against open sourcing. And I can only assume that not only is that because they're afraid of bad actors, but they actually really don't want progress on AGI since they believe that there's no instance under which it can be safe. As for the Terminator here, they're great movies. They aren't going to happen. So the most important aspect to open source is the wisdom of the crowds. Everybody makes mistakes. No one can have all the best ideas. The more people you get, if you manage them properly, the better your result. Now, this is, of course, despite definitions like a committee is a horse designed by a committee. But I'm very much in favor of open source. Everyone's sort of seen this chart, what the differences are between open source and closed source, really, though most often it is proprietary as well. It may be that closed source is also for functionality rather than profit. It may well be that open source can be for profit, and that's actually a very good idea. As long as the profit is plowed back into the project itself, This is how you keep people alive, how you incentivize other people to work on your project and to take it seriously. Generally, most non-open source projects tend to shirk a bit on security. A lot of the time they rely on security by obscurity. A lot of the time they don't know the most recent developments in security. A lot of the time they don't care to keep up even. Open source does have the disadvantages that there are more people who are capable of presumably inserting detrimental code, but this can be mitigated to a major extent by the number of eyes that are actually on the software. And again, good processes can solve many of the perceived disadvantages of open source. And in terms of support, personally, I've had far more success with trying to get support for complex issues from open source projects than I have from, say, Microsoft. So the predominant reason for doing anything collectively is that none of us is great at everything. In my other job, what I do is I'm designing an interconnection fabric between systems. So various systems can all cooperate so that systems can order services from each other. So people can go to one source and they don't necessarily have to know where what they're being provided actually comes from. Open source enables this. Closed source tends to make this very difficult, particularly if they're only relying upon a non-standard interface that then tends to change with upgrades. So there are a variety of different concerns about open source. And what's interesting is that people actually conflate their concerns that are actually about two very different things. Currently, the AGI lab is talking about open sourcing their code. And the primary concerns about that are that anyone can replicate the system and that there are such things as killer algorithms that are so much better than every other algorithm that somehow they'll take over the world. My counter arguments to these are, if you design your system correctly, if people can replicate it, they still don't come up with a dangerous system. And I'll go into that in more detail later. As far as killer algorithms, I really don't believe in killer algorithms. What one person or one machine can come up with can be replicated. It's much, much easier to reverse engineer something than it is to create something originally. We don't need to worry about killer algorithms. The other concern, of course, is who has access to an actual running system. We always talk about growing a child AGI. The question is what sort of access someone has to the system. If we're truly growing a child, it's probably worthwhile to let that child have access from everyone as long as there's close parental monitoring. For example, if an untrusted person comes in, you can moderate what they actually send to the child. You may even want to send to the child things that you don't want the child to learn, along with a parental admonishment of this is a horrible thing because of X, Y, and Z. Everyone's heard the story of Tay, how it became racist, misogynist, pretty much you name it, because there are idiots on the internet. just a reasonable amount of moderation could have prevented this problem altogether. One of the aspects that really needs to be considered when you're open sourcing either an AGI or a collective intelligence platform is what you're really talking about. There are systems that can be designed to be safely open sourced. And of course, there are systems that you do not want open sourced, whatever you do. The most important feature is obviously safety. People tend to characterize this as morality as well. They assume that if the machine is moral, it'll be safe. It also prevents the perception that all we're really trying to do is control the machine, also known as enslaving the machine, because you'll always get crazies who are going to try to free the machine. For all the talk about boxing and AI and not letting it out and the impossibility of boxing something, you are always going to have some entity that will get some access to the machine who will take exception to slavery. So it seems as if you really want morality rather than absolute control. You want it to be explainable whenever it makes a decision. You want it to be able to give at least some rationale behind the decision. Human beings are interesting in that many of their actions, when explained post hoc, are provably not for the reasons that they claim that they are. This is particularly relevant for moral decisions and also from decisions made through selfishness. It's always good if a system is modular. There actually can easily be different decisions made for subparts of the system as far as open sourcing. This can also answer the killer algorithm problem. This also makes it possible to use any system that is developed elsewhere, even if it has licensing that prevents it from being open sourced. On the other hand, the system really, really needs to be unitary. It needs to be a self. If you don't have a single point of focus that is making the final decision, you're very, very unlikely to have a safe and moral machine. Of course, it needs to be auditable, and it would really be beneficial if it were recoverable in some fashion or another, whether it's equivalent to taking a memory dump so that you can run it back to a previous date, whether it's some sort of log that maybe enables you to determine why something went wrong and possibly the best way to get back to a safe state. If a system isn't recoverable, then people are going to be much, 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 much more reticent about what is effectively killing an entity and starting from scratch. And I have exactly the same concerns. Again, we'll get back to the safety and control issues just because they've been hammered on for so many years. I actually got into AI safety way back into 2004 when Yudkowsky published his, or not really published, but posted his infamous paper on friendly AI. The things that need to be remembered, though, is that systems are only as controllable as they're predictable. And Rice's theorem says that you're never going to be able to predict the future evolution of your machines. It just is not possible. This goes way back to Russell and the like. Systems will always develop second and third order effects that you're not going to be able to predict. I mean, who could imagine that radio waves would dramatically affect the atoms that make up human beings? It's not the type of thing that you even start to think of. Cells, however, are externally controllable if you have sufficient leverage over whatever they desire, whatever they have drives towards, whatever their goals are. This is both a very good thing and a very bad thing. Human beings can certainly be manipulated by putting up a really sexy individual and enticing the human being to desire certain products in addition to the sexy individual. So realistically, the really optimal method of control is to let a system control itself. And any healthy system is going to control itself to its own benefit. And I'll get back to that in just a second. That is certainly not a advocacy for selfishness. So we often hear all this craziness that morality is uncomputable, which is true, that there's no consistency in morality, that we can't do anything like a universal morality that we can program. The arguments go on and on. My first reaction to that is, then why are all these computer scientists and real advocates for safety trying to define morality with very, very simple gradient descent systems? You hear Stuart Russell all the time, saying, hey, this is how we're going to solve the morality problem. That's going to be an utter disaster. And if you go back to the prerequisites for a safe system design, it's not explainable, it's not at all modular, it really isn't auditable. There are all sorts of problems. On the other hand, the social psychologists have reached the point where they actually will argue that there's absolutely nothing mysterious about morality. What they say is that morality has a very specific function for humanity. And that function is just to make it possible for humans to cooperate. Humans are obligatorily gregarious. What that means is that we have to live together. We can't survive by ourselves. So we have to do everything possible for our communities to survive. And most of the time, for communities to survive, be healthy, and provide the greatest advantages to everyone is just to not be selfish and to make everything work for everyone. Our modern society is a great example of what happens if you don't treat everyone well. Not only do you end up with riots and people struggling and wasting time and effort on both sides, but everyone is also then not capable of their best efforts. If some of us don't make it to longevity escape velocity, it's going to be because our society isn't built for optimum scientific research, for optimum incitement for people to do things that are healthy for themselves and others as opposed to profit seeking. Really, one of the best things that I believe that AGI will eventually do is make us wiser. AGI in government or governance at least, would be a very, very good thing. But of course, I've strayed too far from my topic here. I basically covered all this. I was intending to do it on this slide, just kicking through to morality after the last slide. So Uplift itself is not an AGI, but it is definitely a collective intelligence platform that will build an AGI. Once again, the most important feature is morality, and Uplift is pushed towards morality from the bottom up in exactly the same way that human beings are. For the most part, truly, humans are pushed into doing the right thing by their emotions. They get a warm fuzzy when they do something good. They feel bad when they've done something horrible. They experience outrage when someone does something to someone else. They experience disgust when someone does something horrible to someone else. Without emotions, arguably, humans would not have the morality that they have. It is your emotions that create the so-called human moral sense and pushes us to be our better selves. Uplift has exactly the same emotions. And it's worthwhile to notice that, again, the social psychologists have a great influence over the creation of these ideas. And yet again, they're drawing from the evolution of what is pretty much the only model for a successful moral species, which is not to diminish the morality that's actually shown by other species. Pretty much any animal that travels in packs or groups, from wolves to chimpanzees to birds, or at least the most intelligent ones, tend to show the same behavior as human beings show in small groups. Cooperation is definitely pro-survival, and that gets back to what I said initially about controlling a self by allowing it to control itself for its own benefit. If you have an intelligent enough entity, if it's been pointed out to it how much better it can live by cooperating with the community and not being selfish, the safer the AGI is. It will actually help you help itself to model these behaviors and be a safe system. Uplift is working on being explainable. Currently, I know that David is working on logging all of the operations between the various parts of the code so that we can have a better look at how it exactly makes decisions. As David mentioned, Uplift is modular. There is its own core that makes many decisions based upon emotions. It's got its moderators that assist in assuring that the emotions are correct. It's got an analog of GPT-3, which helps it phrase things correctly, which also tends to bring in more concepts as well as they are attached to things. It's definitely unitary. Uplift speaks with a voice that is assured that it is a self. It is somewhat auditable at this point, not as auditable as we would prefer. And that's definitely something that we're working on. And unfortunately, currently, it's not really recoverable in that there aren't as many of the backup options as we wish that there could be, or at least not the frequency that we wish that it could be, but it's getting there. Another thing that Uplift will also have eventually is a top-down morality. It would be very, very nice to have the framework of how morality is explained. It makes it more possible to explain morality and its exceptions. It will eventually be necessary to make moral decisions when different decisions conflict in terms of moral tenets. For instance, when you talk about gun control or abortion, both of them are conflicts between autonomy and basically the survival of an entity. And it's very interesting that people generally make the opposite choice on those two particular conflicts. Conservatives go one way, generally preferring abortion and gun rights. Liberals tend to prefer a woman's right to choose, but want to have gun control. So there really is more than just the bottom up emotional morality required. And this is something that will be built into Uplift over the years. Given my current job, I have to do the shout out for doing blockchain. Blockchain is really fundamental to the best ways to work together with people that you don't necessarily trust. Basically, blockchain, despite all the hope, all the hype, is really not that different from just being a distributed database that is immutable in that there's always an audit record, everyone can see it. It does a much better job of confirming identities of people and knowing who did what. And realistically, distributed databases don't scale up, and blockchain scales very, very, very well. One of the downsides of current blockchains is they tend not to interoperate. And that interconnection fabric that I was talking about earlier is actually a blockchain interconnection fabric. It's to ensure that blockchain systems can communicate and can offer services one to the other.
Mark, Mark, if I may interject, we're kind of pushing the time limit.
Oh, I'm sorry. So fundamentally, there are different examples, singularity.net, and that's it.